Caleb Love, one of the stars of the 2022 NCAA tournament, also did the same. So now it's official. UNC is returning 4 starters from a team that played for the national title earlier this month. That's not the only reason why, but it's certainly among the reasons why I have the Tar Heels ranked number 1 in the preseason top 25 and 1. So you tell me, what do you make of Hubert Davis returning, I guess it's 80% of his starting lineup?
Fairly significant news for North Carolina. Not totally surprising, right? Like Armando Bacot returning, I think, was pretty significant. I actually think probably that Love's decision is maybe bigger for North Carolina than it was for Bacot, because like, where was Armando Bacot going? Maybe he enters the draft, maybe he goes late second round, but I'm skeptical. Probably would have been undrafted. Caleb Love, 6'4" guard who can shoot it, has some handles, like a heat check guy. I had him number 43 on the top 60, the big board for the NBA draft. And I thought, probably staying and returning for next year probably would have boosted his stock more than just riding the end of the season and going into the NBA draft. But you're not going to be able to replace a player like Caleb Love. So getting him back into the fold, obviously good news for North Carolina. Leaky Black, RJ Davis, Armando Bacot, and Caleb Love will be back. They're going to have to figure out what they're going to do with Brady Manick gone. I think that's a fairly significant, probably somewhat overlooked portion of what they had last season. He was huge as like a stretch 4. That is a really hard player or type of player to replace, I think, for North Carolina. But no question, I mean, Caleb Love, getting him back in the fold was huge. He averaged almost 19 points per game in 6 NCAA tournament games, had 30 points versus UCLA, 28 versus Duke, obviously the legendary second half versus Duke. And getting him back in the fold, obviously, for Hubert Davis for North Carolina is very significant.
Well, to your point about Manick, I do think they need to replace him with a similar type player. Not only because that's the way basketball is played in this era, certainly at the NBA level, but it's starting to happen at the college level as well. But also because it is the preferable way Hubert Davis wants to play. Obviously, you follow college basketball even a little bit, you know that traditionally North Carolina was trying to play 2 bigs under Roy Williams. And like, who could argue with the results, right? Multiple national titles. Roy kept North Carolina at the tip top of the sport really until he decided to walk away last April. But that style of basketball had become outdated. In Roy's final year, they played Armando Bacot and Garrison Brooks together a lot, and like had Walker Kessler buried on the bench. And so, I know when Walker Kessler picked North Carolina, on some level, like outside of the obvious, it's North Carolina. Why wouldn't you go to North Carolina? On some level, it was like, why are you going there? They've already got 2 traditional bigs. And I think the argument on some level was, well, they always play a lot of bigs, so we'll figure it out. But when Hubert Davis took over, he prioritized creating space to play in and doing it with a stretch 4. It's why he, recruited Dawson Garcia. It's why he recruited Brady Manick. And I remember being on the sideline for a North Carolina game in the non-conference portion of the schedule. And we did a Zoom call the morning of the game with Hubert, because this is before we were allowed to go to shoot-arounds like the good old days. And, we talked to Hubert about that. And he said that because in that moment, you got to remember, North Carolina was still kind of struggling a little bit. I mean, really, North Carolina was struggling until like mid-February. But North Carolina had year in and year out been one of the best offensive rebounding teams in America. And they just weren't anymore. They weren't getting those extra shot opportunities. And it seemed to be a real problem. And it was obvious what the root of the problem was. They weren't prioritizing it anymore. They weren't playing 2 bigs anymore. You got fewer people around the rim. You got fewer people to offensive rebound. And Hubert just said, listen, I still want to be a great offensive rebounding team, but more than that, we want to be a team that creates space, that shoots it from at least 4 positions, and plays a more modernized style of basketball. And it was fair to wonder if that was a proper approach early in the season because it wasn't working too well from a win-loss perspective. But obviously, eventually it clicked. And it didn't just click when the NCAA tournament started. The truth is Carolina started playing at a high level, several weeks before the NCAA tournament started. Uh, recorded one big win after another. And over the final 7 weeks of the season, they performed like a top 3 team in the country, behind only Kansas and Texas Tech, according to BartTorvik.com. So eventually it started working. And now if you're going to bring back 80% of your starting lineup, I feel like it'd be preferable if you could replace Brady Manek with somebody like Brady Manek. I don't think you could find somebody as good as Brady Manek, but you need to find somebody who does the same things that Brady Manek can do, because with all due respect to Puff Johnson, whose mixtape with Leaky Black should be dropping any day, I don't think you just want to go into this season saying we'll just plug Puff Johnson in and keep rocking and rolling, because there's a role for Puff Johnson on this team, but I think ideally it's a come off the bench role.
Yeah, Puff is going to be a great player next season. Like what we saw, I think, down the stretch of the season was kind of just some flashes of what we'll see next season more consistently. But Puff is not Brady Manek. They need someone who can really stretch the floor. Like Puff is more of a glue guy. He's going to be a good defender. He's got really good size. Stat I saw on Twitter from Brian Eves, who works at TV, has a lot of ACC stats. Love's return means North Carolina is expected to return 75% of its scoring from last season. That is the most returning scoring in Carolina history, coming off of a title game appearance. Now, we'll see if it means anything. I think Brady Manek's losses, again, it's fairly significant. They're going to have to figure out a piece that's going to play the stretch 4. And Love has been something of a loose cannon the last 2 years. I think if we're being honest, like he really came into his own down the stretch of the season. I think not coincidentally coinciding with North Carolina's late season surge. But, as a freshman, he was a 5-star, like didn't quite play like a 5-star, was considered to be like a potential one and done type player. Obviously came back for a sophomore year. And really, even after a really good end of the season for North Carolina, obviously came back and is going to play at least one more season at North Carolina. So you want to be able to see this more consistently from Caleb Love. He's a gunner. He likes to shoot it. He has just a fearless quality about him as a scorer, as a shooter, as a guard, that I think unlocked a lot of Carolina's potential down the stretch of the season. I think if he's able to play at a more consistent level next year, like we saw at the end of the season, that the North Carolina is clearly going to be, obviously, they're number 1 in the CBS Sports top 25 and 1. They're clearly going to be one of the top teams in college basketball next season.
Yeah, and Norlander and I talked about this on a previous podcast. When you put North Carolina number 1, are you worried that you're just doing exactly what you did last offseason with UCLA, a team that was, up and down much of the season and then really took off in the NCAA tournament, and then they bring a bunch of interesting pieces back, and you more or less disregard November, December, January. In UCLA's case, also February and early March, and just focus on the end. And though I recognize it's a fair point to make if you're trying to have a conversation about it, but I would push back on it a little bit. Again, UCLA was losing consistently until it got to the NCAA tournament, and then it took off. North Carolina was winning, for about the final 3-4 weeks of the regular season. Again, if you run the data from February 17th through the end of the season, which is a 7-week sample size, North Carolina was performing like the 3rd best team in the country, behind only Kansas and Texas Tech, according to BartTorvik.com. That suggests this wasn't just a team that got hot in the NCAA tournament. Beyond that, they finished higher at KenPom than UCLA did the year prior. North Carolina finished 16th at KenPom this season and entered the NCAA tournament in the top 30. If you go back to last season and look at UCLA, that's a team that entered the NCAA tournament 45th at KenPom. So I just sort of push back on the premise a little bit that this is just a team that got hot in the tournament, like UCLA was just a team that got hot in the NCAA tournament. The last thing I'll say on this is I think it's interesting the way it comes together, and you sort of touched on it a little bit. One of my favorite college basketball stories of the past, I don't know, 20 years, is the only back-to-back national champion we've had in a long, long time, and that's Florida in 2006 and 2007. And it is obviously uncommon, especially in that era, to win a national championship and then return your entire starting lineup. But that is what Florida did. But one of the points I remember making back then was you have to look at the very specific circumstances under which this happened. And to that point, the thing that was obvious was you've got a unique situation that isn't happening anywhere else. In other words, Joakim Noah was the star of the team. Best player, not best player, we could argue. He was the star of the team. He was also the son of a professional athlete. He didn't need to get to the NBA to cash in or to take care of his family. These sentences we hear all the time when people declare for the draft. He was having a blast on a college campus, so he just decided to come back to school. Al Horford was the son of a professional athlete. Long story, not so long. Those Florida players, outside of Corey Brewer, probably didn't need to get to the NBA as quickly as possible to take advantage of this life-altering money. And once the other four, and Lee Humphrey wasn't a legitimate NBA prospect. Torian Green was a borderline prospect. So once the other four come back, Corey Brewer was like, I'll come back too. And we'll just try to do this thing again. And then they did. It was an incredible story. This North Carolina team is similar for different reasons. They've got great college players, legitimate NBA prospects like Baycott and Caleb Love. I think both those guys will one way or another play in the NBA, but they're not obvious, undeniable NBA prospects. Like, they're good enough to be great college players, good enough to maybe play in the NBA someday, but not quite good enough to where, like, if you're Ochai Agbaji or AJ Griffin or Paulo Banchero, where you've just got to go to the draft right now because you can't leave all that money on the table. So this has been a common trend in college basketball in recent years. If you look for who's going to be the best teams in the country, find teams that bring back guys who could have reasonably entered the NBA draft but decided not to for whatever reason. You want a great example? Kansas. Ochai Agbaji was this close to staying in the NBA draft last year, decided to come back and ends up being the most outstanding player of the Final Four, leading a team to a national championship. There's one of those guys on most NCAA tournament championship teams. And now, if you accept that Armando Baycott and Caleb Love could have both reasonably entered the 2022 NBA draft, then Carolina's got two of those guys coming back from a team that just played for the national championship. And then, of course, name, image, and likeness rights, I think, obviously play a role in this. Whatever Armando Baycott or Caleb Love could have gotten to play professionally next season is probably dwarfed by what they'll be capable of making over the next year playing college basketball. Because what is your value to North Carolina boosters or anybody else when you are two well-known, accomplished, heralded basketball players at a program with the brand of UNC basketball? Like, that's worth a lot of money. So when these players, and not just the Carolina players, but anybody else who's doing something similar, Hunter Dickinson or you name it, when they come, it's like unfinished business. I just didn't feel like I'm done with college basketball yet. That's what Hunter Dickinson said. It's all great. I take off. But some of this is, where were you going? And was it a place where you could make more money than where you're going to make playing, than what you're going to make playing college basketball next season? And if the answer is, I don't know where I was going, and probably not, then this is a very sensible, in fact, I would argue the most sensible thing to do. It's great for college basketball, and specific to this story, great for North Carolina, because who knows how the season will unfold, obviously, but Hubert Davis heading into year two has a team that looks very much capable of playing for a national championship once again.
Yeah, it reminds me 2 years ago of Illinois a little bit, right? Where Ayo Dosunmu comes back,
There you go.
Kofi Coburn comes back. Neither of those guys, I think at the time, would have been first round picks. Now Dosunmu comes back, improves his draft stock, goes to the draft. Now he's really latched on with the Chicago Bulls. Kofi Coburn comes back last year after testing the waters and is one of the best college basketball players in the sport. But again, was not a definite first round pick. In fact, maybe not even drafted at all. So they're in that kind of no man's land where what are you going to do? Do you go to the draft? Do you maybe risk going undrafted, or do you just decide to come back? And I think that decision now is made a lot easier with name, image, and likeness rights, because now Caleb Love is, one of the faces of North Carolina basketball, huge brand, a team that is coming off a national title game appearance. They're going to be potentially the preseason #1 team in the sport. Same with Armando Bacot. He's, double-double machine. He's clearly the best player on North Carolina, and he's already cashed in on name, image, and likeness rights last year. Coming back next year for another season, I think is going to be even bigger. So I think we're seeing kind of in real time the influence and the effect that name, image, and likeness is having on college basketball. For North Carolina, obviously, undeniably a good thing.
So North Carolina, #1 in the top 25 and 1. We're up to version 6.0 right now and ever changing. For what it's worth, I currently have Kentucky 2, Baylor 3, Houston 4, Arkansas 5, Gonzaga 6, UCLA 7, Kansas 8, Duke 9, TCU 10. And let me speak on Gonzaga real quick, and then we'll move on. Because I've got some people like, who? Like Drew Timme's entered the draft. Julian Strother's entered the draft. They don't really have a recruiting class to speak of. Why do you have Gonzaga in the top 10? Well, you could just read. But short of that, I'll try to explain. Just because people enter the draft doesn't mean they're staying in the draft. And perhaps Drew Timme thinks he's staying in the draft right now. I just don't think he will. I think ultimately he's going to find out exactly what I just explained. He can make more money playing college basketball as the face of the Zags than he can make playing professionally somewhere next season. So I don't really pay attention to when these borderline NBA draft picks declare for the NBA draft while maintaining their college eligibility, because all that means is they still aren't quite sure what they're going to do. Like, by definition, if you were entering a draft while maintaining your eligibility, it means you're not really sure what you're going to do. And so I think that applies to every one of these people who say that, except for Shaedon Sharpe, because I'm confident he already knows what he's going to do. He's staying in the draft. He's not playing college basketball. Or I'd be shocked if he plays college basketball. That's why I've always had him projected not on Kentucky's roster next season. But at the end of the day, I'm assuming Timmy's back, Strother's back, those other guys are back. I don't have it right in front of me, but there's a scenario where, the Zags lose Chet Holmgren and Andrew Nembhard, but really bring back the bulk of that team that finished #1 at KenPom. And for now, I am projecting Julian Strother and Drew Timme to be a part of that. If they announce they're definitely not coming back to school, then that's how you get version 7.0 and 8.0 and 42.0. I suspect by the time we get to November, we could have 50 different versions of the top 25 and 1. But for now, North Carolina is #1. And though I'd never rule anything out, you start to look what we know they've got coming back and assume they're going to make additions to that. It's hard I'm skeptical that anybody else will be #1 in the top 25 and 1 at any point this offseason. At this point, and I would not have necessarily said this, 3 weeks ago, but at this point, given that all 4 guys I thought were coming back have said they're coming back, and then you've got Johnny Juzang leaving UCLA, Shaedon Sharpe presumably leaving Kentucky, it looks to me like North Carolina probably will and should be #1 heading into the season. But as always, we'll see.